I had a fascinating experience this morning. It's an interesting day in terms of transits. The sun is in 12:4, which is the line of the prophet, and the earth is in 11:4, which is the line of the teacher. So it's an interesting day for prophecy. But I got up this morning and I've had a briefcase for many years, no choice briefcase for many years. And during the last couple of weeks, I've been working on the transparencies that I would use for today. And inside of my briefcase were these transparencies. And last night, my youngest son decided to do a Samsonite commercial and put my briefcase through all kinds of physical tests. And this morning at 20 after 9, I go to my briefcase and I click it and nothing happened. And I click it again and nothing happened. And I figured, okay, he changed the code, but he didn't change the code. And I click it again and nothing happened. So Loki and I, with every possible garden tool we had, pliers, screwdrivers, there I am in full flight manifestor rage, ripping away at this briefcase. I want to tell you that if you do own a Samsonite briefcase and somebody is going to steal it, they are really going to be punished for that experience, because it's not an easy thing to do. As a matter of fact, we never fully got it open enough so that we could slide these things out. So that was the way, and this briefcase has said goodbye to usefulness. So it really is time for some change. I'll get that out of the way so it doesn't end up on. There's many things that I know about this coming mutation. And there are many things that fascinate me about it. So many of the things have an impact on the physical life of humanity now in this time of transition. And there is an accompanying physical transition, a physical mutation that is accompanying what we look at as a mechanical mutation within the graphic of design. There is no such thing as a mutation taking place within the body graph that isn't manifested in the form itself and in the vehicle itself. One of the themes that I'm going to deal with today is the theme of autism. And the theme of autism is important because it's an indication of what happens when we are going through a mutative cycle. In order for the 55th gate to mutate, the 55th gate has a connection to the prostate. And that 55th gate is in a process of mutation. That process of mutation is creating a chemistry, an essential chemistry, and I will actually look at that in detail tomorrow when I look at codons, because it's a specific codon called histidine. And histidine is a codon that involves the 55th gate and the 49th gate. And it is the mutation that is taking place here that's not simply bringing about some kind of minor evolutionary progression to humanity. It's actually doing something really extraordinary. It's finally placing us outside of what we have always thought of as animal. In other words, this is a transition that is taking place that is literally allowing us to jump out of the framework of our mammalian background. I will show you, hopefully, through the course of this day, how that actually works, what that actually looks like. But where we're going to begin is that we're going to begin with this whole process of what that change in the 55th gate is all about. The chemical change in the prostate has led to the production of children with autism. This chemical change in the prostate, which is a byproduct of the mutation that's taking place in the 55th gate, what it is producing, and I'm not talking about men, for example, who have prostate problems per se. There are a lot of men who have the mutation in the prostate taking place in which it does not become diseased. There are others where the mutation taking place in the prostate is something they are simply not designed to handle, and then it begins to deteriorate into disease. And this is a disease that's very much a part of the post-1781 process, and one obviously that's become more and more evident. That transformation has led to an impact to the channel 1949. I've known for many, many years and have discussed it for many years that autism clearly for me was rooted in this channel. And one of the things to recognize about it is that the autistic state, if one takes away the negatives of the autistic state, and we'll talk about that, what you really have is a glimpse of what's coming. And the fact that it is not yet time, the mutated prostates are producing phenomena that we are labeling as autism, and it is autistic because it isn't in its right time. The time is 2027, and the time is coming. I'll show you how this works. I'll show you how the progression is going to take place in the mutation. The 55th gate and the 59th gate, as you can see in what's labeled here as stage 1. Now, by the way, there's no dating on these stages. Recognize that the insights that are provided by design, particularly these insights that are there for us to be able to follow our evolutionary process, that things that are taking place at the evolutionary level are not taking place in somebody's lifetime. You know, it's not like this can be easily dated from one point to the next. There will be overlapping in these stages, and it will take hundreds of years for this process to even, begin to flower as a generalized process. In other words, mutation is something that comes into the world and slowly it works, and if it's successful mutation, if it's viable mutation, then it will succeed and it will expand. What date I can give you is that I know, at least I know from what I was told, that the first children will be born. The first children will be born with the finished diagram that I will show you in the afternoon. The finished children in this process, the first examples of these mutative children will come into the world in 2027. That's the beginning of the process. But how long that whole process takes, we're talking about hundreds of years. It begins with the stage 1, and the stage 1 is the relationship between the 55 and the 59. This is the arm in the cross of the sleeping phoenix that is going to be transformed. And it's going to be transformed through the agency of the 55, but you can see that in order for it to impact on the 59, its mirror in the wheel, its opposition, that it has to go through a specific circuitry, it has to go through a specific energy field in order to get to that point. And one of the first things to recognize about this mutation that's taking place in the 55 is that this does not stand alone. Nothing does. And that the first thing that is there to initiate that is the presence of the 39th gate. In other words, that mutation is something that is provoked, if you will. It needs to be provoked. It needs to be jabbed. It needs to have all of that in order to take place. After all, the 3955 is a mirror of the 28 and the 38, and you have that mirror to the struggle. There is always this potential and power of struggle in this emotional field of the 55 to the 39. But it's a very important agency. After all, one of the things to recognize about all of the root gates is that all of the root gates supply the basics that we need for anything. They provide the true foundation, the pressure to do it. And so here in the beginning of this, you have this pressure that is there from the 39th gate. And without that pressure from the 39th gate, you do not have the beginning of that mutative process. The other thing is that this mutation, as it takes place, is going to change the way in which energy flows within the rave. In other words, ultimately, it's going to change the way circuitry flows within the rave. And this is the beginning of the transformation, if you will, transformation in the circuitry. One of the things to recognize is that two things have to happen at the same time. And the 55 and the 59 represent those two things. On one side is the 55 that says, here is a mutation bringing something that is new. New. And the 59 says, here is a mutation that is going to end what's old. Ending what's old is us. Us. In other words, this is the coming sterility, the coming infertility that is already at work on the planet. And this transformation in the 55 does precisely the opposite in the 59. In other words, it starts killing humans in order for raves to be born. It starts terminating Homo sapien because Homo sapien is not where we're going. Where we're going is to the real rave. Remember, we're a transition field. We are a transition field. If I am carrying the mutation in my prostate, and there are all kinds of men who are carrying this mutation, I don't know if I am. If I am carrying that mutation, it does not mean that I can produce one of these children until after 2027, and hopefully I can still make children after 2027. We'll see. But if I made one of those children now, the right chemical information, blah, 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 they would come out autistic. In other words, they would come out deeply and severely socially handicapped. They would have enormous problems integrating with other human beings. And of course, there's a great joke in that. That's precisely what the future demands for spirit awareness. And I'll show you how that works. As Tom Waits said, the large print giveth and the small print taketh away. That's the 55-59. There's a role that the root center gates play in their pressure on the emotional system. What the root center is always trying to get the emotional system to do is stop waving. In other words, the root center is always trying to fix the emotional system. And it's always trying to fix and hold the emotional system. That's its ongoing task in bringing the solar plex ultimately to a point in which the wave is not what it's about. That is, the motor wave is not what it's about. Think about the nature of love in the 55th gate. We talked about yesterday that the 55th gate loves loving, that it's its limitation because it doesn't get to love. And it doesn't get to love because it's fickle. It doesn't get to love because it can't make up its mind. It doesn't get to love because it's always caught in that wave. And that the provocation of the 39 is always trying to get it to bite so that it will hold on and stay with something. Well, one of the first things to recognize about this first movement here in the first stage is that the moment the mutation clicks into the 55, it fixes. It then meets that provocation, which is no longer provocation. And in that, the 55th gate eliminates the motor wave. And the motor wave is gone. And what you have instead is the very, very rudimentary beginnings of awareness. Awareness in a place where there had never been awareness. And all of this is the fixing. That's why if you're a 19 and you can get a 49 to stay with you without divorcing you, you've succeeded in bringing them to a fixed place. It's always about the way in which the root is always trying to bring the emotional system to a place in which it is fixed, in which it no longer is caught in that wave. And that in this moment, at the very beginning, that's the very first thing that has to happen, is that the emotional wave in the 55 stops. Now, by the way, though the 55th gate may be, in terms of how we see it in analysis, the moodiest of all gates, the gate of the glass that's half full and the glass that is half empty, It's also important to understand that the emotional wave in individuality is less volatile on a day-to-day basis and can be an emotional wave that goes through long planes. It is this very basic nature in the 55 that opens it up to, through mutation, being much more easily fixed. That's why the mutation's there, in the individuality, in the mutative process. So here the 55th gate fixes. And in the moment that it fixes, it ends the motor wave and it begins the awareness process. And as you can see, the movement is down into the root. Over the years in my basic trainings related to design, I've always gone back to this root center is an extraordinary thing. It is, after all, the way in which the whole energy field of what we are as beings is conditioned. And that this energy going down must go down into the root, because if it doesn't go through the 360, it doesn't bring the mutation to humanity. In other words, it can be an isolated mutation, but not necessarily a mutation that can then go out and impact on everyone. It's one of the jokes of evolution. We always assume that it's something new. And we assume that it's something new because it looks like something new by the time that it gets out. But the fact is that it's very old. It's always been inside of us. It just waits for its moment. All of these things lie inside of us waiting for their moment. Everything has a moment. Everything has a catalyzing agent that suddenly brings it to the fore. And you can see that in the way in which this energy moves, because this energy moves into the 60th gate first. In other words, the mutation really only begins when the 60th gate gets that mutative energy. Because within the 60th gate is all the old genetic information. In other words, that's our genetic library. Our genetic library is sitting there in the 60th gate. It's storing all the genetic material. It has within it the capacity of moving a piece of junk DNA out, and suddenly there's a change in the chemistry. In other words, everything about the 60th gate is that it's a storehouse of all the genetic information we hold, not necessarily the genetic information we live out. And therefore, out of the 60th gate comes the potential of bringing the mutation out, bringing something that has been dormant and waiting, and suddenly bringing it out, and it starts there in the 60th gate. By the time that it gets to the 3rd gate, that's the moment that you have something that is irreversible. It's the most important thing to recognize about mutation in the 360. It's a format energy. And it is a format energy that has enormous impact. So much of human design is individual. And this format energy is very profound. And at the moment that the 360 carries a mutation, that mutation is in the world. Whether the mutation is going to operate properly or not is not the point of that. The point is that once you get to that, that's why it is stage 1, once you get to the point that the 360 is involved in that mutative process, then you have something that is going to be in the world, and you're not going to be able to stop that. In other words, it's cooking. It's like Jürgen and I when we first started in design. I'm a 60, he's a 3. You know, when the 360 brings a mutation, the mutation tends to last. In other words, that's the power of the 360 in its capacity to change us, to mutate us. So this is a very important stage. But remember, it's always been there inside of us. You know, the 9-centered being was always waiting. You know, it's not like it just popped out of nowhere. You know, it was always there. In other words, each of these transformations, it's not like we didn't start off with that information pool. We did. What's happening to us is that certain things are clicking in as we move along, and that clicking in is starting always in the 60, and if it gets to the 3, then the mutation is alive. When we come to stage 2, if you could call stage 2 anything, you could call it the death of desire. It's one of the byproducts of stage 1. The changing in the nature of the role. In understanding the way in which the 50th gate and the 6th gate operate, that both the 50th gate for the spleen and for the various forms of awareness that we give names to, taste, judgmentation, intuition, instinct, all of that was rooted originally in the 50th gate. And out of the 50th gate, those various forms of awareness, then diversified. When we're dealing with the 6th gate is responsible in that sense for originating the motor wave. In other words, it's out of the 6th gate that the other 3 streams, or these 3 streams, diversify that information out of the 6. And despite the fact that we begin with the flattening out of the wave, or the elimination in that sense of the wave by fixing the 55, the potential for the awakening of awareness in the solar plex center waits for the 2nd stage. In other words, it's only when the 6th gate is transformed that the potential for the entire solar plex is there. In other words, this movement here is essential. But recognize something about the oppositions that are involved in all of this. We've already seen the opposition movement with the 55 and the 59. Here we're seeing that with the 6 and the 36. In other words, the 36th gate in many ways is the archetype of being unaware. That stream of feelings is never going to experience awareness. It is driven by desire. It's the human experiential way, and the 36th gate is the deepest aspect of that, because that's the aspect that is ready to break into experience, to penetrate experience. It is also the most sexual of all gates. And so that the moment that we have this movement of the 59 to the 6, and the mutation then goes into intimacy. It's no longer about the role anymore. It is about the nature of intimacy itself, the transformation, if you will, of intimacy. And in the moment of that transformation of intimacy, one of the things that happens is that the information stops at the 6 and does not go to the 36, that the 36 gets left out. And you'll see that it gets left out because you'll see that the movement then of the 6 in stage 3, which is into the 3740, in stage 4, that movement is to the 49. In other words, that the stream of feelings, the abstract stream, isn't going to get any of this mutative information. Now, going back to great courses that I've been teaching since the early 90s, I've talked about how the fact is that when the change does come, and I mean the ultimate change of really changing forms, this stream isn't going to be there. In other words, this stream from the 41st gate going up to the 35th gate, this represents our human experiential way. But the whole thing about the coming rave is that this isn't human. I mean, not human in our context. And the human experiential way is not a part of that awakening awareness. So here in this movement of the 59-6, we have a very, very big step that takes place, because what we have is we have the eliminating of desire as an aspect of bonding. In other words, the human way of desire, the human way of bonding, the way we've been experiencing for the tens of thousands of years that we've been involved in this process, all of that is coming to an end. There is a new kind of intimacy that is emerging. Okay, that brings us to stage 3. One of the things about the transformation that takes place in the 6th gate is that, as I said, that 6th gate transformation is the most important one in terms of spreading the mutation and spreading the mutation to the rest of the solar plex system. Mystically, the 6th gate is the gate of the builder. And it is about building, it has the capacity within it to transform what has been the motor wave. And remember, not completely. The motor wave is still going to exist in the abstract process, and that the motor wave is going to change slowly, and it's going to change in sequence. That sequence is going to begin with in stage 3 with the 4037. In other words, rather than the 6 going to what is natural for it, which is the 36, which is its opposition, it cuts that off And its priority is to bring that into the 4037, into the channel of community, into this social mechanism. The channel of community is going to take on a different function. After all, the channel of community basically is a way in which the pair bonding that we have been designed to operate through, the way in which that pair bonding or those pairs come together in mutually protective and supportive groups. In other words, the idea of community or the idea of tribe that's discussed in the context of the 4037. One of the things that's inherent to understand about the transformation is that the moment that you take away the wave is the moment that you don't have to deal with the bargain. And this is one of the most important transformations that is going to take place in the context of the 4037. 4037 is a dilemma. And the dilemma is that this is the only place within the body graph in which the business of working out agreements with the other is inherent. In other words, that the channel of community is about this fundamental bargain. We saw, for example, yesterday the bargain that brings the potential love of work out of the 40 to bring that work to the other in order to be the provider, in order to be nourished, in order to be cooked for, all of those various things. These are old bargains, and we also saw that that bargain was something that was gender-oriented until 1781. As a general theme. In other words, that what we saw in that was that the provider in that sense, it was conditioned to be the male, it was designed to be the male, the nourisher in that sense was the female. We've seen that that has broken down. We ourselves in our time cannot talk about those as gender archetypes anymore because the gender archetype is breaking down. All of that is part of this transition that we're in this mutative movement. It also means that the social bargain is breaking down. We see that in the West, for example, that the standard of the family, which was inviolable up until the 1780s, the standard of the family is going through enormous transition. And that the family order in that sense is breaking down, that the bargain is breaking down. That, one of the byproducts of that is you see, for example, the legalities now that are directly connected to marriages, prenuptial agreements, all kinds of things that are, written down legally because the basic bargain has deteriorated. So what we're seeing here in the third stage is that the moment that we get out of the wave, after all, that's the only reason the bargain's there. I hope you get that. The only reason that the bargain's there is because there is a wave in the emotional system. And the bargain is an attempt to fix the wave. The bargain says, okay, here's our deal, this and this for this and this, that's it. It's an attempt to fix that wave. Anybody who deals with 4037s, though, know that because they're in a wave, that the bargain can take on different perspectives, that the bargain can look like it's changed, that the bargain can feel like it's changed. In other words, this is an ongoing process that we saw the root gates moving up, trying to fix the emotional center, the 40th gate moving down, trying to fix the emotional center, fix the bargain. Here's the deal, whether you're up or down, here's the deal. Now, of course, as long as there's a motor wave, that's practically impossible because the motor is so powerful. So one of the most essential things about the future of bonding is the elimination of the need for a bargain. It's not about if I do this, you do that. It's not about if I love you this much, you have to love me that much. It's not about all the bargains that have been built into our relationship with the other. You're a good neighbor if. There's all these bargains that are inherent. The bargain is going to disappear. See, as long as we have an emotional wave, everything connected to the solar plex center is always trying to control that wave. It's always trying to fix that wave. It's always trying to get it to a point that it won't go up and down and away from some point that can be consistent. And so the moment we have this transformation, that's an incredible thing. Because, of course, that's the moment that the way in which community meets each other, that they can meet each other without having the distortion of the wave or the need to follow emotional authority. See, this is one of the basic transformations that takes place. Those beings who will come into the world, and you'll see this afternoon, I will show you what they look like. Those beings who come into the world, if those beings, not everyone is going to carry that mutation. And it means that there are still going to be those that are caught up in the wave, and in being caught up in the wave, have enormous difficulties in being able to find a fixed way to relate to each other. You're going to have a whole new group of beings that don't have that bargain, that don't operate out of that, and no longer are subject to emotional authority, which is, as we know, waiting out the wave. Somebody who has an awakened solar plex center does not have to honor emotional authority because they're not, by our definition, emotional anymore. And of course, this is one of the things that autistic children have to deal with. Is how alien the emotional system is. Because they are part of this transition, moving away from, emoting. After all, the whole system of emoting is being transformed in the 55. So very important to see that this movement here, the 4037, this is going to transform the way in which we can meet, because we meet outside of the bargain. There doesn't have to be a bargain anymore. I've written about it, I've talked about it. So much of the way in which this mutation operates, because it's actually working at many levels within us. But one of the most fundamental or mundane and obvious levels is food. The old joke about you are what you eat. It is about food. The changing from a 7 to a 9-centered structure in 1781, that was coincidental with other things taking place at the same time. One of them was the warming up. In other words, in order for us to go from 7 to 9 centers, we actually warmed up in order to create the mutative potential that would open up that phenomena. That warming up is also something that was going on around us. Comment Jürgen made, I think, yesterday to me about the fact that so much of this global warming also has to do with the sun itself. It has to do with the cycle of the sun, and it's inherent in our program. We are warming up. One of the things about that is that mutation thrives on diversity. And it thrives on diverse input, and the diverse input has come through food. Food is a medium through which this mutation is furthered. Since that transformation, since the end of the 18th century, not only have we expanded the well-being of humanity, but one of the most important things we've done is that we've expanded the human diet. I've talked about the fact that the limitation of diet is a road to extinction. The panda bear that can only eat one kind of leaf, they're easy to eliminate. Human beings, in the vast diversity of their diet, can survive on just about anything, and that diversity of diet is part of the mutative change. Well, look carefully here at what we've been looking at. It starts in the 55th gate, is in that sense provoked out of the 39. The 3955 is always about food. It's where you find all kinds of food problems. You find bulimia, you find anorexia nervosa, you find all kinds of difficulty with food, moodiness attached to food, depression attached to food, all kinds of things connected to food in that channel. We're going to have a fixing of the wave in the sense that that is going to lose its emotional quality. But what it will also do is it'll also go so very, very deeply into what is an individual trait. In other words, finding something that works for it, that it likes, and then making that a dominant part of its diet. What's the 4037 if not the stomach and the mouth? In other words, this elimination of the bargain isn't just an elimination of the bargain. It is a transformation that is coincidental to a change in diet. See, they're not going to eat the same food we eat. In other words, what is going to be interesting for them in terms of diet isn't something that's natural for us as diet now. In other words, they're going to have a dietary mix. I can't imagine what that is going to look like, in the sense that I don't know what the mainstay of that diet is going to be. See, so much of the way we've been eating has to compensate for the burning of the emotional system. So much of our eating is connected with wave patterns. The consumption of food that we need, the amount of food that we need, is all connected to the emotional wave in the world. And the moment that you eliminate, at least in most places, that wave, you're going to change a lot of things. You're going to change the amount of volume that's necessary for nourishment. In other words, the volume itself is going to change. But more than that, because of this transformation where food is an essential key, and it ends with the 49th gate, which is all about how you make sure that food is available for everyone, that all of this is about a transformation in diet. And it's one of the first ways we're going to be able to notice these children, is that they're going to have odd food tastes. In other words, there's going to be something very different about the food that they're open to and the food that they will naturally reject based on their chemistry. The other thing is, of course, that the traditional way in which humans have nourished their young will change, because the needs are going to be very, very different. There's a real transformation in diet that's going to take place that they are going to live out, that's going to be part of the continuation of that mutative process. Over the years, I've talked about the way in which various circuits deal with each other. And I've always talked about how there is a natural affinity between individual circuitry and tribal circuitry, because the tribal genetic pool needs to be transformed occasionally, needs to be freshened occasionally, and so the tribe is always open to individual mutation. However, neither the tribe nor the individual has a clear or comfortable way of dealing with the collective or in transforming the collective. And you can see this mutative phenomena in these graphs in which nothing has to do with the collective, that the collective is cut out of this. It starts as an individual mutative field operating through the archetype of mutation in the 360, and then the first thing it does is the 59.6 and the 37.40, and of course there you have the heart of the tribe, there you have the heart of our deepest social interaction with the other. You know, those are two specifically social channels, and social at the tribal level. And that not only do they have to do with bonding in the 59.6, but the maintenance of the bond, of the building of the houses and the communities and everything that's there in the 40.37. And it also has to do with our basic sexuality. It may be that the 59.6 is there for us to be sexually reproductive, but part of the bargain of the 40.37 is providing pleasure for your partner, hopefully with not producing too many more children. In other words, all the aspects of sexuality that are not reproductive are also caught up in the bargain of the 40.37. The moment you take that away, you're not just transforming intimacy, but you're eliminating sexuality, not only from the bargain, but as a criteria for who you can be deep with. Human beings, given our limitations, we're basically designed to be deep with somebody from the other gender. And that our deepest relationships operate that way. That the deepest bonds that we make, because of the nature of sexuality and the way that works mechanically, this whole business of being, deep with somebody is a mixing of gender. That's not the case the moment that you take the sexuality out of the bargain. It's gone. And all of a sudden you have a different kind of intimacy, and you have a different kind of social phenomena. A social phenomena that has nothing to do with gender, because it has nothing to do with desire, it has nothing to do with sex, it has nothing to do with reproduction. Nothing. It only has to do with being socially intimate. And being socially intimate and enjoying the same food, so to speak.
Ra hat ja über die Jahre immer wieder auch auf die unterschiedlichen Schaltkreise hingewiesen, wie die miteinander dann zurechtkommen und hat immer wieder hingewiesen, dass die individuellen Schaltkreise und die Stammesschaltkreise zusammen gut miteinander auskommen können, einfach weil die Stammesebene auch dann eine Erfrischung oder Erneuerung und Verjüngung auch des Erbmaterials braucht, die eben vom Individuellen in den Stamm dann hineinkommt. Also der Stamm ist im Grunde offen auch für individuelle Mutation, nimmt sie in sich hinein, damit das Blut aufgefrischt wird. Jetzt haben aber beide, der Stamm wie auch das Individuum, haben dann enorme Schwierigkeiten, wie sie dann mit dem Kollektiven eigentlich umgehen. Das ist gar nicht so einfach. Und das Kollektive fällt hier raus. Das Kollektive geht, erstmal haben wir den Prozess der Mutation über die 360 dann, dass es dann irreversibel wird und dann über die 59,6, über die 37,40, dass dann hier die allerdirektesten und tiefsten gesellschaftlichen Interaktionen, die gesellschaftlichen wechselseitigen Begegnungen dann hier in diesen Kanälen 59,6 und 37,40 dann hier von der Mutation erfasst werden, während das Kollektive eigentlich total draußen bleibt. Das ist sehr wichtig in der Bindung, auch die 59,6 als Intimität und Nähe für die Fortpflanzung. Da ist die 40,37 dann enorm wichtig, um den Rahmen zu schaffen in der Familie, in der Gruppe, damit auch diese Paarbindung dann, die erstmal für die Fortpflanzung eben hier auch dann einfach angelegt war, dass das dann erhalten bleiben kann, den äußeren Rahmen, dass die Familie eben auch dafür sorgt, dass dann die Fortpflanzung auch geschehen kann. Die 59,6, dann auf der anderen Seite die 40,37 in enger Zusammenarbeit über die Abmachungen, über die jeweiligen Verträge, die man da schließt, zum Beispiel auch den Vertrag für die 4037, inwieweit die beiden Partner sich gegenseitig Freude bereiten und aber trotzdem nicht zu viele Kinder in die Welt setzen, also was da alles so an Abmachungen eben getroffen wird. Die ganzen Aspekte der Sexualität in den Abmachungen, in den Vereinbarungen über die 4037, alles das wird wegfallen. Und was dann hier wegfällt, heißt natürlich auch, dass die Sexualität, so wie wir sie kennen, ausgelöscht sein wird, verschwinden wird, dass es hier einfach nicht mehr darum geht, wie bis jetzt, dass man normalerweise eigentlich so gewissermaßen, wenn man tief mit einem anderen Menschen zusammen sein möchte, das eigentlich immer auch nach dem Archetyp von Frau und Mann, also von unterschiedlichen Geschlechtern ablief. Und dass man, wenn man eben sagt, die tiefste Beziehung war zu dieser Frau, die tiefste Beziehung war zu diesem Mann, immer vom Gegengeschlecht her, dass diese tiefsten Beziehungen jetzt, wenn die Mutation stattgefunden hat und die ganze Bindung sich verändert hat, dass diese Bindung offen sein wird für eine Mutation, dass die Mechanismen sich hier, wie wir sie bis jetzt kennen, ändern werden und dass wir dann tief mit einem anderen Wesen sein können, was jetzt nicht das andere Geschlecht sein muss, dass diese ganze Geschlechtsbezogenheit in der Bindung wegfallen wird. Das heißt, in dem Moment, wo die Sexualität raus ist aus diesen ganzen Abmachungen, aus diesen ganzen Vereinbarungen, wenn die Vereinbarungen selbst weggefallen sind, weil die Sexualität weggefallen ist, dann haben wir eine andere, unterschiedliche Art, wie wir miteinander zusammen sein können. Das hat nichts mehr zu tun mit Verlangen, nichts mehr zu tun mit Geschlecht, nichts mehr zu tun mit Sexualität oder mit Fortpflanzung. Und dann können wir gesellschaftlich intim mit Menschen sein, wie wir es uns heute gar nicht vorstellen können, und dann zum Beispiel auch gemeinsam uns freuen am guten Essen.
That brings us to the final stage. And in bringing us to the final stage, there is a movement here of the 6th gate to the 49th gate. I don't know if you can, I'll raise that up a little higher so you can see that. In looking at that, you'll notice not only is there this movement, but you'll also notice in the graphic that the 19th gate has been eliminated. That is, the channel as a whole has been eliminated. This is one of the most dynamic things that takes place, and as I will show you this afternoon, I will show you what the transformed circuitry is going to look like and how that circuitry is going to operate. But one of the keys in the transformation of that circuitry is the breaking of the connection between the 19th gate and the 49th gate. Now, it's not terminating the 19th gate. As you will see, the 19th gate will continue to function, but it'll function differently than it functions now. That is for those who carry the mutation. But one of the most important things to recognize is that by cutting this connection between the 49 and the 19, there is a transformation that takes place that is really spectacular. See, look, all mammals have the potential of the 19th gate. And they have always had a potential through the 19th gate to connect to humanity through the 49th gate. Because, of course, this is part of the ongoing bond that we have with them genetically. In other words, that there is a deep enough connection between the two of us, that there is a place for us to meet. Well, that place where we can meet is going to disappear, because we're really not going to be like them anymore. In other words, there is a transformation that's taking place that ends the mammalian relationship that we have. See, if you take away the emotional wave, you take away almost all physical violence from the world. I mean, almost all. I'm not talking about everything. If you take away the emotional wave, you transform the way in which we bond with the other. All of that is a change. And the animalness that is there, the 49th gate doesn't have anything to butcher anymore. It's one of the biggest transformations in terms of what this species is going to look like. You see, we're killer monkeys. That's what we are. You know, we're sophisticated killer monkeys. And these are not going to be killer monkeys. By the way, that doesn't mean that they're all going to be nice, you know? It just means that they're not killer monkeys. There is a transformation that's taking place, and that transformation is taking place in the breaking of the circuit, in the breaking of the channel, so that the 49 and the 19 no longer connect to each other. Now again, this fault line in the 49-19 is causing so many problems. That is the autism that I've discussed, all kinds of deep emotional difficulties in people. 19th gate, 49th gate can bring out all kinds of emotional problems in life. So one of the things about that is that the transformation of the 49, when you flatten the 49, when you take away the tribal wave that's there, what you get is a fixed principle. No more marriage and divorce. No more acceptance and rejection, no more wave. Simply a fixed principle. And that fixed principle does not require support in the traditional sense. It's not there to fulfill the need of the tribe, which is to feed them. As I said, the diet of these creatures is something that will be very different. I have no idea what that will bring. But it will be very different, because when the butcher stops being a butcher, there's something unusual afoot. You know, we already see that. We see that with the BSE phenomena. We see that with hoof and mouth disease. We see that with the problems that we have with our wealth in being greedy for the taste of meat, and what happens to us when we raise animals in the way in which we do, and what the impact is going to be. None of that, by the way, is a moral question for me. All of that is simply about seeing it's part of the mechanics of the change that are taking place. The diet is changing, and the butcher ultimately is going to go away. That is, they're going to lose that, because they're not going to be in competition with the animal anymore. If you're not in competition with the animal, you don't have to kill the animal. By the way, which means that they won't necessarily kill humans the way Cro-Magnons wiped out Neanderthals. When you're looking at this illustration in stage 4, what you're looking at is what the core of these beings are going to be. As you'll see this afternoon, it forms a circuit. This is a new circuit. And I'll get into the description of that and how it all works, but I want to make sure that you really grasp what it means to have this channel disconnected. You see, the 1949 as one of the mystical channels, as the root of our spiritual process, It is out of the 19th gate that we are placed under pressure to need God. We are placed under pressure to have spirituality, to have a shelter, to have the right mate, to have all of those things. That's the pressure that's there in the 19th gate. And that the moment that you eliminate that pressure, the moment that pressure isn't flowing into the 49, trying to fix it, find us one God, find us one safe home, find all of those things, fix those things. The moment it's there, you have to see that these beings are free of that. They are free of the need for territory. See, they're not animals. We're animals. We have to have territory. They're not animals. They don't need territory. We're animals. We're in awe of the forces. They're not. They won't need God. They're not going to be in awe of all of that. That isn't going to be their number. We're animals. We carry all the mammalian fears. It doesn't matter what age you are, you hear some burst in the middle of the night and it's all that animal fear coming to the surface. Oh my God, the gods are here. They won't have any of that. They won't have the need to control territory. And they won't have the need to control territory for the benefit of their diet. Because that's what animals do. They defend their territory in order to make sure that they have enough to eat. They defend their territory so they can be assured they have enough to kill. It's not there. It's not there. And the basic need for shelter, the basic need for physical community, not there. All of that is gone. And all of that is eliminated in the moment that there is this final mutation in this fourth stage to the 49. And remember, the 49 and the 55 have almost identical chemistry. This is the histidine codon. And this is the codon that's changing everything because it's not human. It's just not human, at least not human as we understand it. And it's deeply mutative, and it's this bond between the 49 and the 55 that you get the alpha and the omega of this movement, beginning in the histidine of the 55 and ending in the histidine of the 49. In other words, making the complete circuit as it goes through to establish this circuitry and finishing with the same mutative chemistry. And it's that completion at this point where you really do have a being that's very, very different than what we understand. Oh yeah, it's not like they're going to look particularly different from us. There will be physical differences, there's no question about that. But it's not like, there's going to be any grand difference on the book cover. But the way in which they operate, and as you'll see, the way in which they commune with the other is alien to us. And it's alien to us because we are part of the 1949. We are part of it. We can't get out of it. The animals, the gods, the spirituality, the whole business. This is our human trip. That's why me at a mechanical level as a teacher can actually play this game of bringing it out to this point so you can just see it. And you can see it all coming to a close. And you can see what we are and what our limitation is as mammals. As mammals. So, in that breaking of that channel, of redirecting the 19, as you'll see, the 19 will exist. It's not going to go away. But it's not part of this circuit. It's not part of this core of what the future is going to look like. Just a final comment before lunch. I want to put this in as clear a perspective as I can for you. The nine-centered rave that we work with, that we study and analysis that we deal with, it's not like it's going to go away. It isn't. And it's not like the vast majority of human beings are going to live out this. They won't. The vast majority of human beings are going to continue to live out the designs that we have with minor changes, as you will see. In other words, that there will be an impact at some level, but basically there isn't enough time for the transformation to take place completely. There isn't. And it'll take hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years before there is enough of these beings, enough of these specific beings, that they're actually some kind of weight in that sense in terms of the way in which the general population is structured. The point is they're coming, and they are going to be here, and they are going to be different. And whether or not we are going to be able to live with them is another story. Because the human, as we know it, the nine-center transition wave that is us, it's going to hang around until the end. You know, the Cro-Magnons and Neanderthals lived side by side for tens of thousands of years as far as we know. Some say as much as 100,000 years together at the same time, and we don't have that amount of time at the end. So what we're seeing is we're seeing something new come. It is a leap towards what will be our real future when the transformation of this biological form disappears. But this is the last major biological mutation. And out of that, the potential of the spirit of the consciousness of humanity will begin to shine. In other words, out of this transformation that takes place, we're going to be able to break down barriers that we, within the limitation of our forms, have never been able to do. To go beyond what it is to be personal. What I will show you this afternoon is the design of something that has no self. It has no self. It's not like that's their own, that's in them. It's part of integrated into whole graph, as you'll see. But nonetheless, those beings that carry the mutation, this is where they operate out of as a matrix. There is no self. There is no self. We don't know what that's like. We're animals. You know, there isn't an animal in the world that doesn't make a noise to let everybody know that they're there. You know, we're all by ourselves. And this is something totally different. It has nothing whatsoever to do with the mammalian and the personal as we understand it. There's no self. And then we'll have lunch. Even prophets have to eat. There was a show I did in 1987, and I said, fools are liars and prophets too.